My favorite question in a group, say people who work together, is how many other people have to do their job well for you to do your job well? Do you commute to work? Do you ever think about the bus driver or the engineer or the car mechanic? Or if you don't commute, there's certainly some kind of technology probably involved. Have you eaten today? And you don't grow all your own food. Just think about that, that our lives truly, realistically, are part of a network. We can feel so alone and cut off, but the truth is really that we're connected. We're also, I think, culturally tuned to we'll feel better about ourselves if we can only put other people down, and so it's kind of a culture of degradation,
Yeah. And
you
that's
know.
particularly true in the university, by the way.
Oh, that's scary and sad. People just get into that, and there's a lot of loneliness right there. So what's it like? It's like I see all of Dharma practice as kind of like an experiment. Are you willing to just make an experiment and step out of those ruts that are so familiar? Like go into work and maybe express some appreciation for somebody. So let's make an experiment and do these reflections and see what happens.
Hello, welcome everyone to another episode of Dharma Lab. I'm very honored and excited to be here with our two guests. Of course, I'm here with Richie Davidson, who many of you already know, one of the eminent neuroscientists on the planet. And we are here with a true icon of the world's meditative traditions, Sharon Salzberg, who's also a dear friend and truly one of these people who, when the history books are written about the manifestation, you could say, of these meditative traditions in the modern world, played an incredibly important role. In fact, just before this started, we were all chatting, and Sharon, you were mentioning that this is the 50th anniversary of Insight Meditation Society. So IMS, as it's commonly referred to, is really perhaps certainly one of the first and one of the most important centers for Buddhist practice and Buddhist meditation, and really just meditation in the modern world more generally. There are a few people who are teaching meditation and practicing it seriously, who either you've been there and you've been to retreats, or you've practiced, or you've certainly heard of it at the very least. And Sharon is one of the co-founders of IMS back in the 1970s. It's hard to believe it's been 50 years. She has written some of the most well-known books in the meditation world. Loving Kindness. She literally wrote the book on loving kindness, and I think it's been the main proponent of it as one of the main forms of meditation coming out of the Buddhist tradition. So traditionally known as metta. She also has a podcast known as Metta Hour, which both Richie and I think Richie, you were just on Metta Hour just a few months ago, right? If memory serves. So wonderful podcast, and has written many, many other books as well. In particular, her first children's book. Maybe you could hold it up. She was just showing it to us. It's called
There's
Kind
my
Carl.
children's book, Kind Carl.
I've read it to my 6-year-old granddaughter, who loved it, absolutely loved it, and wanted to get more copies to give to all her friends.
So many and many, many other books: Real Life, Real Love, Real Happiness, a whole kind of series with that title. And these are just wonderful books. Loving Kindness, the book I mentioned first, is really a modern classic, and it's something. It was one of the first books I personally read back in the 90s when I was starting to meditate. So I think, Sharon, you've been an inspiration to so many of us, and your work, whether it's through your writings, through co-founding IMS, through your endless teaching all over the world, just an incredibly important influence for meditation and Buddhism in the modern world. So it's an honor to have you with us. And I thought, we could maybe just start with a story that I have heard a few times and I always found moving, was this story of His Holiness the Dalai Lama visiting the United States for the first time and your interactions with him. And maybe we could just start there as just a little bit of a life coming, something from your direct lived experience, and then we can see where the conversation goes from there.
Sure, that's fantastic. And I'm so happy and honored to be with the two of you, truly. Um, so we co-founded the retreat center, Jack Cornfield, Joseph Goldstein, and I, in 1976. And it's in Barre, Massachusetts, which is about 40 minutes away from Amherst, Mass. And in 1979, we heard that the Dalai Lama was coming to Amherst. So being young and bold, we wrote a letter to the private office and said, maybe he'd like to visit us too, and to our amazement, we got a letter back saying, yeah, he'll come. So that was like an incredibly zooey day, and we had sheriffs and people patrolling the roof with guns and, blockaded the street. I mean, it was just a very intense day. And I had been in a car accident maybe, a few weeks before that happened. I had a broken bone in my foot. I was using crutches, which I was not very skilled in using. So I was standing way in the back of like 100 people. And then his car pulled up. He got out and he did something that I've seen him do many times since, but it was the first time. It's almost like he has a kind of radar for who in a crowd is suffering the most. And that was me. And he just cut through 100 people, took my hand, looked me in the eye and said, what happened? And standing there in the back, I've been thinking, I'm so stuck in the back. This is terrible. I helped start this place. Here I am in the back. But if I go up front, I'll fall on my face because I'm so bad with the crutches. I better stay in the back. And he just dissolved that, with that one comment. And it sort of redefined compassion for me because I realized he certainly couldn't have made the injury not have happened or made me any better with the use of crutches, but that horrible feeling of being so alone, so unseen, so stuck in the back, it just dissolved. And there's actually another story about that visit, and there are many. But we had a retreat that was ongoing. It had been happening for about 2 weeks. And the Dalai Lama asked to go into the meditation hall and give a talk. So he did that. And then he asked for questions. So this young man raised his hand and he said, I've been meditating for about 2 weeks and I realize it's not going to work for me. I can't do it. I don't have a capacity to grow or learn or understand or get more loving or more mindful. He said, I just can't do it. And the Dalai Lama looked at him and said, well, you're wrong. You're just wrong. And he went on to talk about, Buddha nature or one's capacity, which it's believed is never, ever destroyed, a capacity for growth and understanding and change. It may be covered over and it may be hard to find, but it's never, ever destroyed. And a funny thing about that story is that after the talk was over and he had left, all these people came up to me and said, the Dalai Lama shouldn't have said that. That's bad pedagogy. You should never tell anyone that they're wrong. But who got a huge amount out of it was the young man, for whom it was like such an important message. Like, yeah, you should have a little more faith in yourself and the possibility of change.
That's so beautiful. And just the image of the Dalai Lama kind of cutting through all these people, and at a moment where most of us would be kind of on autopilot, like this is what you do in this situation. You go and you shake the hands and you wave and he didn't. It was just this human. He was just utterly human and could see beyond, just the dynamics. I've just always found that story so beautiful.
Yeah, I love that story too, and I've heard it from you before, and I just have this image of our detectors or antenna for suffering that can actually be developed, and the Dalai Lama is such an extraordinary exemplar of that. And wherever suffering is occurring, he makes a beeline for it.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
And the human element of it, that's something that I really think about with you as well as a teacher. In fact, I was just having lunch with my wife, Kasumi. We've been together 13, 14 years now. When we first met, she was just about to go on a retreat with you. You were visiting Madison, and it was just like weeks before she was just about to sit one of her first retreats and her first retreat with you. And you've been a huge influence in her life as well. And I was just talking over lunch, and I just said, "Oh, I'm going to be talking to Sharon. Like, what would you ask, or what?" And we were just talking, and she said something that is so true, and I think I've heard from many people, certainly my own experience, is it just you talk so candidly about your own experience and the human experience in such an authentic way that's quite uncommon, of just being able to be fully human and just share your experience, which is so nice because it's so easy. You see somebody at the front of the room teaching something like meditation, and you imagine, wow, they've got it all figured out in this perfect life. And here I am, I'm a distracted, anxious mess. And I think that's one of the reasons why you and your teachings resonate so deeply with people. I'm wondering, with all these decades of having worked directly with people and having heard, I'm sure, from thousands and thousands of people, what are some of the things that either really easily trip us up, that are kind of the common stumbling blocks when we're just kind of getting started, or the things that kind of inspire and unlock us when we just hear the right thing at the right time? I mean, what stands out to you as the kind of the things that have emerged for you over the years of what really is helpful for people to hear?
Well, I think we, including myself, we bring some of our greatest patterns into the meditative process, especially a kind of harsh self-criticism, which I've seen over and over again. Even people who are in, really bad situations, really difficult diagnoses, or, something that is kind of hard to bear. And it's like, sometimes I listen and I think, give yourself a break. This is kind of hard. Look what you're going through, so there's that. And I think that's one of the reasons that I found loving kindness practice, or that understanding that we can grow in other ways rather than punishing ourselves for our mistakes, and we can move on. We can learn to begin again. There's resilience there. I found that a huge help for a lot of people. And these days, somebody just asked me the other day if I wanted to kind of teach Buddhism or better mental health. And I said, mental health is not that high right now. This is really, so many people feel broken and lonely and estranged and confused. And of course, we always have to some degree, but it feels like it's so exaggerated now, so emphasized now. And for people to have a sense of not being so alone and caring about themselves and caring about one another, having a greater sense of community seems to be really what we can offer these days.
That's so helpful. Rishi, any thoughts from you, having explored the same territory yourself, both personally and in your work?
Yeah. In terms of the situation today, I think that it really is true. There is, I often say we're all part of a grand experiment for which none of us have provided our informed consent. And it's really a challenging time. And a lot of it is simply outside of our control. And, the one thing we have at least the possibility of exerting a little bit more control over is our own mind. And so that's a really great place to start. And one of the things that I love about your work, Sharon, and your message, and would love to hear a little bit more about, is that at least I have found, as I've been with different kinds of public audiences, that giving them a simple taste of like very ordinary but really nourishing connection, like a little hit of appreciation, bring someone into your mind and your heart who's been helpful to you, and just observe what happens. And being able to taste that little hit is really an elixir for our soul. And it's also very accessible. It's not, we don't have to go to any special place. We don't have to do any, be in any special posture. We can do it anywhere, anytime, which is a phrase that Mingyur Rinpoche has used for, one of his programs, and I've sort of renamed it everywhere all the time. Why not? And so, I'd love to hear your reflections about that.
I think that's a beautiful, there are many layers that I want to respond to. One is I've so appreciated your work and the use of the word connection. I have been struggling to translate metta, which is the Pali word for loving kindness, METTA, because loving kindness is such an odd term. Like you wouldn't necessarily be in a coffee shop and hear the people on the next table talking about loving kindness, except maybe in a, hyper religious context or something like that. But so my concern is that that might make the qualities seem somewhat arcane and removed from day to day life and precious in the negative sense of the word. I've had translators and scholars say to me, well, stop being so cutesy. Just say love. That's what you mean. And that, of course, is a complicated term. Like, what do we mean when we say love? And how often it's like a medium of exchange, or I will love myself as long as I never make a mistake, or, something so fragile and breakable. The favorite term I use for the translation is connection. I think there's a classical translation as friendship, but my concern about using friendship is that I don't think the development of qualities like loving kindness or compassion mandate a certain kind of action. When I think of friendship, I think, let's go to the movies together, or let's spend time together. And it may be that your heart is genuinely full of loving kindness or compassion for someone, and discernment, wisdom, understanding is saying, don't go there. It's not safe, or it's not appropriate. Uh, and I find, there's such a great fear. Like if I were to develop more metta, more loving kindness, I would have to say yes, or I have to smile. I have to, give in, something like that. And we don't have to do anything. So I really prefer the word connection to any other. I love the idea of appreciation, just for a moment. And it's sort of part of what I like to teach or guide if I'm going into a company or an organization or some group. It's two reflections. One is, can you express appreciation to somebody, anybody? Because we're also, I think, culturally tuned to feeling we'll feel better about ourselves if we can only put other people down. And so it's kind of a culture of degradation.
Yeah. And that's particularly true in the university, by the way.
Oh, that's scary and sad. And so, people just get into that, and there's a lot of loneliness right there. It's hyper competitive and constantly putting other people down. So what's it like? It's like, I see all of Dharma practice as kind of like an experiment. Are you willing to just make an experiment and step out of those ruts that are so familiar? Like, go into work and maybe express some appreciation for somebody. And the other is really interconnection. My favorite question in a group, say people who work together, is how many other people have to do their job well for you to do your job well? And, sometimes that doesn't resonate. And so I say, do you commute to work? Do you ever think about the bus driver or the engineer or the car mechanic? Or if you don't commute, there's certainly some kind of technology probably involved. And, if that doesn't resonate, like, have you eaten today? And you don't grow all your own food. Just think about that, that our lives truly, realistically, are part of a network. We can feel so alone and cut off, but the truth is really that we're connected. And so let's make an experiment and do these reflections and see what happens.
Well, that's great. I wonder if we could, I realized that actually I myself skipped a step that we had talked about and that Richie and I do every single time, which is usually before we hit record. We do this little practice to set our motivation, really to be a benefit and wanting whatever comes of the work we do and the discussions we have to help people and to be a benefit. I wonder, and Richie, you talked about having like a little taste. Sharon, would you be willing to just lead a little mini practice just for anything to give us a little experiential taste of what we're talking about here, and then we can keep going?
Sure.
Keep our flow of practice going.
Okay, I'll do a reflection sort of based on what I just said, okay? So,
Wonderful.
you can sit comfortably, close your eyes or not, however you feel most at ease. And we're just gonna spend a few moments bringing to mind anyone who has somehow had a role in your being here right now. Somebody told you about their meditation practice or the science or, um, this podcast. Somebody read you a poem or played you a piece of music. There was some opening somewhere. Maybe you've never met these people who come to mind. Maybe you've been inspired from afar and just see who comes up. Like every time I do this reflection, I think about the Board of Regents of the state of New York, which gave me a scholarship, which was how I was able to go to college, which is how I ended up in India as an independent study project, which is a big reason why I'm here now. Sometimes I do this reflection and I think about those people whose actions have really hurt me, not the ones I just found annoying, but those times I've felt like I'm at an edge and I've got to find a different way to live or think, because they're part of why I'm here right now, too. It's just who comes to mind. And you can extend a sense of recognition to all of these different beings, because this moment in time is a confluence of connection, relationship, influence, interaction. And however alone we sometimes feel or cut off, this is the truth of our experience. And you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we can end that reflection.
So beautiful.
Okay.
Thank you, Sharon. You know, when I first started these practices, I had been doing mindfulness practices for probably 7, 8 years, and I encountered some teachers. And for me, the first practices that were more kind of in this heart connection space was the practice of sending and taking, which is referred to as Tonglen oftentimes, but very much in this space of loving kindness and compassion. And it was very interesting what that did. And I wanted to ask a question about it, because one of the first things I noticed was it brought up an intense feeling of vulnerability for me. And at the time, the way it manifested was um, I would be having a conversation with somebody, and out of the blue, I would start blushing. And I come from a long line of like Olympic level blushers. I don't know, like our Scandinavian complexion or something. I mean, it's like very visible. Like there's like no hiding. And I remember this experience. It went on for months where almost every interaction I had, for like no reason at all, I would feel this kind of naked vulnerability. And it was just it was just connecting with people actually. And I did not see it at all up until that moment. But when I started doing these practices, I started to see actually how guarded I was a lot of the time. And a lot of the ways I interacted with people were kind of like this weird protective mechanism that I hadn't even been aware that I was doing. And I think that feeling of vulnerability that weirdly manifested as blushing was just a genuine connection with people, but in a kind of a raw way that I wasn't used to. And so it was actually hard. It was not easy for me. It was kind of inspiring, and I was seeing things about myself that I hadn't seen before. But that feeling of vulnerability was actually it was just interesting, challenging territory to navigate and totally unexpected. Like it was not even on my radar when I first started those practices. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about vulnerability and the power of kind of working with that in practice, despite the discomfort, the obvious discomfort of doing that.
I think it's a really fascinating thing to explore. Like, what are the components? Um, I don't know that this at all was your experience, but it is a common experience that people feel somehow they are responsible for fixing a situation
Right.
if someone else is expressing pain or manifesting some painful circumstance. Not only do we feel with a kind of sensitivity that you're describing, but it enters us in some weird way. Things get distorted. We have this hyper sense of responsibility, like I've got to fix it. So we would call that a, a very real imbalance. Maybe there's a lot more compassion for someone else than there is for us. Or maybe there is not enough wisdom, for correct boundaries or discernment to be happening. And so the combination of the sensitivity with the wisdom we would call equanimity.
Mm,
It's a kind of balance. And so I just think it's fascinating to see what is that feeling of vulnerability. And uh, certainly we are conditioned by and large to look the other way in
right.
terms of other people's situation. And um, my favorite part of loving kindness practice actually is loving kindness for a neutral person. That's someone we don't especially like or dislike. It's someone we just feel kind of neutral to. So usually people will pick somebody like the checkout person in the grocery store they often see but don't have any real sense of connection to. And I love it because over time what happens is here's someone we usually objectify, overlook, look through instead of look at. And as we do loving kindness practice, which is offering them attention, may you be happy, may you be peaceful, something like that, something actually grows inside of us. And people come back with these incredible stories like, I fell in love with my dry cleaner. And I said to this woman, or I didn't say, she could see from my face, I thought they were dating. And she said, no, not romantically, but he's my neutral person in my practice. And every day I call him to mind and I wish him well. And she said, now I go into the store and it's like we're on the same team, And so I think one is also confronting all that conditioning of like, look the other way. They're not like people, they're just, utilities or something. Um, Not to mention bias or prejudice, which would also fit into that, those are the other and they don't count. So the more we tune in to people and realize they do count, that we are part of this whole, certainly we will have the effect of that, but that effect does need to be balanced.
Mm,
Yeah, the piece about neutral people is so powerful, and one of the, greatest teachings for me has been, on that, note has been being with the Dalai Lama in situations like, major kind of formal events where there are, quote, lots of important people around, and then he'll go out through like a side entrance and, he'll stop and greet all the custodians, all of the kitchen people, the security people, and he treats them exactly the same as he treats the quote important people. There's absolutely no difference whatsoever. And when you see that in practice, when you see him stopping and holding them and asking about how they're doing, it really is such a powerful reminder that this really is accessible, and it can totally change our life when we do this. Our everyday life becomes all of these really nourishing moments of connection.
And you're also reminding me in saying that so many times we can actually understand connection or loving kindness or compassion as an emergent property of paying attention.
mm,
And that if we're actually more present and listening, and, that's where the connection is born, which is sort of a nicer way of realizing it rather than thinking, I've got to drum up some kind of feeling I don't really have,
No.
and make it happen or manufacture it.
I mean, that's what stands out to me about that story about you on the crutches, is that it wasn't as though he had memorized some rule book of like more elevated compassion. It was just that he was totally tuned in to what was
Yeah.
going on in the moment and who was in front of him. And conversely, I think it was the vulnerability I felt in that moment that I described, was seeing that how many of my interactions are kind of governed by a script. Like, this is what I say or do in the situation, rather than just being fully there and authentic and spontaneous. And so there was something in that story about the Dalai Lama that kind of felt like it's just that spontaneity of really just being there and seeing what's actually happening. And then you don't think about it. It's like you said, it's not you. You don't have to have some feeling or some thought or impulse. It's just a natural response because you're
Hmm.
just fully there and fully tuned into what's happening. It's so beautiful. But the vulnerability, like getting to there, I think
Hmm.
from where a lot of us live, is kind of awkward, honestly. It's like we're sort of like relearning how to be human and how to be connected to people in a way that,
Yeah. Yeah.
without that kind of rawness where we're feeling either threatened or awkward or, any number of other things.
But that's another reason why it's quite reassuring to have a sense of community. You're not the only person who's making this experiment. And even to hear, like, I'm very curious, do you still blush or is that over? You know?
I think so I don't, occasionally I do. I think the one of the few times I blush these days is actually when I tell that story. But what I learned in that, I mean, it was a great practice because it went on for months and it was
Mhm.
so inescapable. It was very clear, like I could either go lock myself in my room and, you know, isolate myself, which clearly was not healthy, or I was just going to have to apply the practice I was learning. So it was I think it was two things for me at the time. One was just to allow myself to feel what I'm feeling. And like you were saying, just go easy on myself. And I had been very harsh, having had a lot of social anxiety. So that was something that I felt like I was over at that point. Like I had
Mhm.
gone through a period where I really worked with that and kind of felt like, oh, I don't long, I'm kind of past that now. And then here it was again. And so I think just not beating myself up about it and really just feeling it fully. And then somehow staying in that space of connection where the vulnerability was almost like a practice of just stay in the kind of the rawness of it.
Mhm.
And just to kind of be human, be my messy life and messy self and not have to fix anything. That was the practice rather than I will transcend this and no longer feel this anymore. It was like, no, okay, maybe this is the rest of my life. I'm just gonna have this. So I think it was less than whether I do or not blush anymore. It was more of a comfort with the whole
Mhm.
cascade of, just okay, I can let all this play out and it's fine. But that took practice to sort of, the universe gave me a lot of opportunities to practice, but that's definitely what happened. So I wonder, one of the things we wanted to ask about, kind of maybe shifting gears a little bit, is so you wrote Loving Kindness and you started teaching this and talking about this back in the 90s, and mindfulness was not even a thing yet. I mean, it was, the big thing it became, decades later. But certainly then this was a pretty new practice for like, coming into the more kind of secular meditation world. And even for Buddhist circles, it was, not nearly as well known as it is now. And I think for a lot of traditions, it kind of feels like there's a sequence of you start with awareness practices or mindfulness practices, and then you might move on to these
Mhm.
practices. And I'm curious, and I know Richie, maybe you could kind of tee this up of just how we might think about this a little differently. Maybe I know this is also a scientific question we have, but Richie, do you want to
Yeah,
tee
sure.
this up for
Thank
discussion?
you for you teeing it up, Court. Some of this emerged in the context of the book Danny Goleman and I wrote, Altered Traits, and that book was published in 2017. And at the time that we wrote that book, we reviewed the scientific literature on meditation, and there were clearly there and still are many more studies on mindfulness type practices than there are on loving kindness and compassion practices, but there was beginning to be a scientific literature on loving kindness and compassion practices. And Sharon, I know you yourself have contributed to that in work that you've done with various scientists. And one of the things that we observed, that is, we being Danny and I, when we were writing that book, is that there was evidence in the scientific literature of benefits that were measured with very short periods of practice. And that it seemed, at least at that time, and I believe it's still probably the case today, that on a variety of kind of standardized measures, some of which you might think of as, quote, objective measures that don't, and here I just simply mean measures that don't depend on a person's own self-reported their experience, that benefits emerge with loving kindness and compassion practices pretty quickly, or at least there's some evidence for that. And then in the work that Court and I have been doing, and in the development of our Healthy Minds program, which includes practices of awareness as well as connection and other practices as well, one of the things that we notice is that some people prefer to start with maybe connection as where in the standard sequence, as Court was mentioning, we typically invite them to do awareness practices or mindfulness practices first. And then finally, the last piece of this, and then I'll stop and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, is just to acknowledge that one size does not fit all. And there are many different paths. And it's probably a bit of hubris for us to think that there's a single path that's going to be best for everyone. And so I wonder what your thoughts are about that, given the range of teaching experience that you've had. If you can, what if there are some essential insights that you can share with us?
I often think that some of the greatest obstacles to people practicing loving kindness, and I certainly teach in a pretty classical way, with repeating phrases, making that offering to yourself and to others, um, is even believing it's not stupid, it's having some sense that it's a powerful way of being rather than the sort of doormat like, endlessly smiling at nothing kind of practice, and the fact that it can be trained, which I found a particularly Western sort of problem that people perhaps think it's like a gift. You've either got it or you don't. And if you don't, you're out of luck. Whereas, obviously in the East, it certainly can be trained because it is an emergent property of how we pay attention. And we know attention can be trained. That's exactly what meditation practice does. And so if people do not get stuck with those particular issues, then I think many people find it an easier practice. Certainly to begin with, it's meaningful. It's opening. It's easier to concentrate. Often for people, the breath can be a little bit of a soporific and then you're asleep. But here you are making this offering. There's maybe imagery or there's something very alive about that sense of connection, which can be a lot easier for people. They may have a faith tradition they come from, which will have sort of the principles, if not the practices, embedded in it. And so it feels like coming home in a way to something that's pretty precious. And they say the Buddha taught it as the antidote to fear. So as a remedy for anxiety, for example, it's the exact parallel for our time, which is a pretty anxious time. So I found there are many people who do find it easier if they can only trust it in some way.
That's great.
Do you have a sense of what the easiest point for people to get started? I mean, these days there's a lot of talk about self-compassion, and it's even, I wouldn't say controversial, but in more traditional formulations, sometimes that's not a thing at all. I mean, in the Tibetan tradition, you kind of go to loved one, neutral
Mhm.
person, as you said. And I love neutral person because it sounds like there's some people who are like somehow inherently neutral. Well, obviously they're neutral to us, not inherently. And then
Right.
difficult people and then all beings. And we sort of bypass the self. And these days, of course, so many of us have so much, self-hatred or fear or all sorts of things towards ourselves. But in all your years teaching, what have you found to be just the easiest entry point for people just to get going if this is new territory?
It's funny that you said that about neutral people. I've always wondered about like the social etiquette of saying to somebody after a retreat, "You were my neutral person." Like I found you totally neutral. I was really kind of indifferent to you. But anyway, I think some of that is really a sense of, which is hard if you're teaching, via an app or something like that, which is reaching a larger number of people. But some of that is really sensing the person and also receiving feedback. I was once doing a program with Barbara Fredrickson, who had done research into loving kindness meditation. We were on the stage, and she said something like she felt it was very important for people within a couple of weeks to have some sense of um, the effect of the practice, of the loving kindness practice, or else they would just stop doing it. They'd be too discouraged. And she said it's especially hard because you start with yourself, which in the Burmese or Theravada tradition, you do start with the offering of loving kindness to yourself, and then you move on to someone who's helped you or something like that. And she said, so it's especially hard because you start with yourself, and that's so hard for so many people. So I said, why don't you change the order? Just change the order. And she said she felt at that time, I know she's changed her mind since, that she could not do that because of scientific research needs for things to be in just the same sequence. And I realized at that point we had two different goals, And I just said I changed the order in 10 seconds, if someone was in front of me and it was too much of a struggle. Um, you do start classically with yourself, offering loving kindness to yourself, but you don't have to. But I find there are problems all along the way, truly. And so it takes a sense of investigation and experimentation and not feeling so alone in your practice often. Because I've had people say to me, I don't have any benefactors. That's the word. It's a classical term for those who've helped us. And they say, I don't have anybody. Somebody said I had an unprotected childhood. I've never had people kind of on my side, and then you think, well, that's a problem too, even though we say, oh, just move to the benefactor, it'll be all shiny, and, you'll feel, oh, there is love in the universe, and not always. So it is a process of figuring out where that entry point is. But I found as a practice, as a growth experiment, it takes some time, it takes some repetition, and the openings, which are genuine and real and liberating, may not be evidenced in your meditation practice, in your formal practice. They're shown in your life, which is where it counts, because that's where we actually need it, but we don't always think to look there. And so people think, well, I still don't have these great waves of loving feeling or something like that. And it really does not matter, truly, because when we're then interacting with a stranger or we've made a mistake and we're seeing how we speak to ourselves or whatever the case may be, we start to see the shadings of difference. That takes great patience too. It's like, how do you know if it's working? Well, it also depends on where you look to see what the effect is. So um, it's a practice that is not formulaic, even though you're repeating phrases. It's very creative. The principle I was taught when I did it intensively in Burma was it needs to be done in the easiest way possible. And that's hard. If it's too hard to offer loving kindness to yourself, move on to someone else. There is another category in this whole sequence that we do over time of a difficult person. And it's said to best be a mildly difficult person, not the person at first, not the person who's harmed us so horrifically in life or we feel has behaved so terribly on the world stage, it's nearly impossible. Start with someone who there's like a little bit, of unease, and then over time, we move on. But I also found there's often a place, certainly was in me, and people don't like that, and they say, "Don't you think I can do the real thing? And why do you think I'm a coward? And, what about this horrible person?" And that tendency to do something in the hardest way possible doesn't really fit in this approach. And so that's a whole context of learning as well.
I love the kind of playful experimentation. And I think that's the challenge. Like, you read a book or you hear a teaching and it's usually presented in some way. And then there's a sense of like, oh, I should fit myself into that progression. And I think what you're saying, which I can definitely see, not necessarily in the way that Tibetan approach is presented, but you can sort of intuit the way that it evolved, was very much based on that. They found something that worked for them culturally. And so it's kind of funny. I'm sure you've heard this many times over. The way that it's often presented in the Tibetan tradition, in terms of that progression, is they start with a loved one, and specifically they start with your mother. And in Tibet, mothers are like deities. They're like gods. I mean, they revere their mothers like no other culture I've ever seen. And so it makes perfect sense why you start there, because there's this natural sense of gratitude and natural sense of connection and nurturing. And of course, whatever you want to say about most other cultures, certainly here in the US, we have some complexity in our experiences with our parents generally. And I think that's the first thing the Tibetans learned of, oh, people aren't responding to this in this very, intuitive way. But I think the way, what you're saying, is kind of like you look for the you look for the
Yeah.
connection point. Like,
Yeah.
where is it easy? Where's it natural?
Yeah.
And then kind of you nurture that. It's like, where can you get the spark happening? If it's not happening, you don't just keep, forever
Yeah.
doing something that's clearly not working. But then once you have the spark, how do you kind of keep that alive? And then you can extend it, to something that might be just gradually more challenging. But I think most of us, we hear that and we think, oh, that's the right way. And now I need to just do it that way.
Hmm.
And if it's not working, somehow it's my fault. Like it's like my
Yeah.
problem, and I just need to keep going with it. It's not easy. Richie, what have do you remember your early experiences doing these practices, and what resonated with you, or any of your own
Yeah, I mean,
process with it?
first, I think that this last bit of conversation is so important, and just this theme of not fighting with your mind, and approaching it with curiosity and openness, and exploring what might be the natural opening, the natural door through which you can go. And it's not going to be the same for each person, and that's fine. And that's just, that's the nature of being human. We're different. Um, and so, I really love that, and it resonates, I think, deeply with the approach that we often take. For me, one of the things that has been so important was, I mean, when I first discovered these practices of loving kindness and compassion, I'm, just naturally a touchy-feely guy, and I needed this. I
Just for
really.
the record, that is an understatement in the best possible way.
So, but I needed my heart to be nourished, and so it was really important to me. And one of the things that has been such a blessing um, is developing little rituals that I bring to my everyday life, where these practices are just they're so much a part of what I do every day. Um, from like making tea in the morning for my wife to when we had cats. Our kitty recently passed away, and so it's no longer a ritual. But I used to every night I'd scoop the cat litter and do it as a practice, and it's just a little bit of shift of a mindset, and what might ordinarily be thought of as a kind of yucky chore became something that I actually look forward to doing. It was beautiful. It was just done as an offering and appreciation. And you alluded to this earlier, Sharon, but one of the things we human beings do pretty much on a daily basis is eat. And eating is just it doesn't take very much reflection to recognize how unbelievably interdependent we are. I mean, to get food on our plate requires this extraordinary village. And that sense of appreciation for this interdependence and you can when we talk about this in our book, there's a chapter where we talk about developing these daily habits, and we talk about piggybacking them on to these activities of daily living, like eating. And so eating, to use a term that's a bit of psychological jargon, but it really conveys a very important meaning. And the term is affordance. So we can say that eating is an affordance for the expression of appreciation and for the recognition of interdependence. That is the very moment you are approaching sitting down to eat, it automatically arises. And being able to have your everyday life, when you do this, a few times a day, every day, it changes you. It's really why we've come to the view, and we actually have evidence now to support this, that it's easier than you think. Doesn't take much to get these circuits of the mind, if you will, going, or circuits of the heart, because this is who we are. This is our nature, and we're just recognizing that.
That's beautiful. One of my students, to my eternal amusement, coined the phrase microdosing loving kindness.
Yeah,
For exactly like that. You sit down
exactly.
to a meal, you just spend a few moments. Or I have a friend who looks at all the little faces in a Zoom meeting in the boxes and thinks, may you be happy. You have to be silent in a lot of these circumstances, but just making that offering. And then you start the meeting.
Yes.
So I can't believe we're already at the end of our time here. It feels like we could go for a few more hours. But maybe just to end, if you have any parting thoughts, I think to state the obvious, we're in a time, in an era that just seems to be pervaded by a feeling of division and a lack of connection. We might have connection with our close circle, but so much division outside of that. So just any parting thoughts, just whether individually, collectively, how we can perhaps bring more of this into our lives, wherever we are on the path.
I mean, I love what Richie was just saying. It's like we can do it. And we don't have to think of this monumental task. It's just, okay, this meal, this moment.
Mm.
It really makes a difference.
Well, on that note, maybe we'll just end with a note of gratitude to you, Sharon, for all of the incredible work and activity, tireless effort to share these practices and ideas with so many people. I know it's made a huge impact on our lives, even our scientific work, and so many others who we hear from and interact with. So it's been an honor to have you on and to have this short conversation. And yeah, I'm truly grateful for everything that you've done and continue to do.
Well, thank you so much.
Deep bows, and I have these fond memories of the. One of the things we didn't mention is Sharon taught the very first meditation retreat for scientists at IMS that was sponsored by Mind and Life, and that was a pivotal moment. Sharing these practices with the scientific community, and I'm just so grateful for your dedication and just unfatigable effort to bring Dharma to the West. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you both.
To be continued. We hope to have you on again sometime. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.